Welcome, everybody. This is our final Forever Green Fridays of this academic year. I'm so glad that everybody's here. First, we have a super special guest star, Grace. She's going to be talking about optimizing farmer peer networks through interviews with network organizers, and then she's going to leave to go graduate, to go walk. Like she's going to leave right after her talk, so we'll send her out in style. And then we're going to hear from Caleb and Ebony from the Savanna Institute on agroforestry in the Midwest. As always, I want to acknowledge our funders, the Environment and Natural Resources Trust Fund, the Minnesota Department of Agriculture, Clean Water, Land, and Legacy Amendment, Builders Vision Philanthropies, the McKnight Foundation, among other very generous donors that make Forever Green's work possible. Thank you. And before we go to Grace, we got a super quick slide from Cora.
It's already that time. We're thinking about the fair, and Forever Green will be at the Ag and Hort Building again this year, and we will be sending out volunteer information across various communication channels. But we wanted to get it on people's radar, so just a reminder, like for a 3-hour shift, volunteers will get a free fair ticket. So it's a $17 value. You could get multiple tickets if you do multiple days. That's pretty cool. You also get a free t-shirt and just a chance to spread the word on Forever Green's work with your friends. So it's a fun opportunity. If you want to make sure you receive communications about the State Fair volunteer opportunities and any other volunteer opportunities, please scan this QR code. And that's all I got. So yeah, just wanted to make sure people are starting to think about this because it's coming up.
Just got off my bike. Two quick things. Clean Water Council this morning to talk about our proposal for funding, and it was the Budget and Outcomes Committee, which is influential, and they were very supportive. So a good shot in the arm of confidence that we have good, strong support out there going forward. And then the other thing I wanted to mention, unless Claire, did you talk about next week? Okay, so next week, same time, same place. Not the entire community that is typically invited, but we kind of are doing a focused all hands meeting of kind of research leaders, PIs, postdocs who kind of are in a leadership role in our work to talk through some things that are coming. And the biggest one is, what we've mentioned before in this space, the emerging crop tracker tool that we're developing, which is intended to help us better, more strategically structure and sequence our work, decide where to invest, evaluate our progress, and just generally be more strategic as we manage this innovation process, not just in R&D, but across Forever Green. And so we're going to have a pretty deep dive. Well, a lot of time, but it's a complex topic, so we'll see how deep we get. We want to have this community engaged and hear your thoughts and keep you updated about this new tool that's going to come forward over the next 6 to 9 months. And we'll deal with a couple of housekeeping things too. So just if you've seen that or not, if you got the invitation, I could say, please try to prioritize being there. I know it's hard in field season. It's the last time we'll ask you to come into this room at noon on Friday until the fall. So
It's a 306 Borlaug. Don't come here.
Same time, different place.
Dick Jordan, Director of Forever Green. And I've also had the delightful pleasure of serving as Grace's advisor in her honors thesis work. Grace is a plant science major at the University of Minnesota who will be graduating with the highest honors shortly, I guess. And I just want to remark on how Grace has undertaken the work that you're about to hear about. So Grace is a plant science major being trained in the natural sciences, yet she has undertaken a project that is a project of social science, for which she had to learn a lot to be able to do it. And Grace and I have been talking for 2 years. So she's very commendably planful in, realizing that to undertake work like this, she had to, start early. And that's not all that common in the world of undergraduate research. So additional hats off for that. And the only other thing I'll say is that Grace is starting on June 8th a job as a regional crop educator for University of Wisconsin Extension in Trempealeau County and other lovely spots in Driftless in Wisconsin. And that's a remarkable achievement for someone who is just graduating. So I could go on, but I've been told to be concise by Claire, so I'll shut up. And
Thanks.
Breaking down barriers to conservation through optimization of farmer peer networks, through interviews with network what is the farmer peer network? Peer networks are organizations where farmers are centered around a common mission, often related to increased farm resilience or adoption of agricultural conservation practices. They're places where farmers can meet and share their knowledge, learn new things. And these networks are really important because they provide farmers with a community. And that's especially important since farming can be a lonely profession, which is something that was mentioned by several of the interviewees in this project. Not only that, this community can also be a powerful tool because farmers are able to observe conservation practices in action on their neighbors, challenge each other to set goals, and feel empowered to meet those goals by a like-minded community. In this project, I decided to focus on the peer network organizers because much of the literature has focused on interviewing farmer members and getting their perspective. But I feel that from this research that network organizers are an understudied group and provide a lot of insight about different practices that have been tried in the network, how successful they have been for different farmers, and just have a more bird's eye view of the network. So my goal with this project was to create a resource for the interviewees that I spoke with to learn from each other, and also for hopefully a broader community of network organizers to be able to have a resource for when they're starting a network, or if they want to improve their network, learning from others who have done that. And so this talk is going to focus on 6 core themes, which are listed here. Just kind of an overview before we get started. And the methods for this research included interviewing 13 farmer peer network organizers, and those interviews lasted from 45 to 75 minutes. The verbatim transcripts of those interviews were then coded by hand using the participants' own words and initial coding methods. And then from those codes, themes were developed. And then once those themes were developed, then quotes that aligned with those themes were collected, and that's the result that I'm going to be sharing with you today. The interview questions focused around introducing the network's role in conservation practices, network challenges, and creating a successful network. And then here is a list of the interviewees. Give you a moment to observe, and most of these interviewees were from Minnesota and covered a wide range of different kinds of organizations. And the first theme that came out of this work was the need to create social time and space. And this is really the foundation of any network, but it's important to highlight because this kind of intentional time gives farmers the opportunity to build connections and make the relationships that keep farmers coming back to the network. And it can also be a place where farmers can change minds, ask questions, and debate ideas. And this is especially important because, as one of the interviewees said, farmers will trust the information they get from their fellow farmers and give it a little bit more weight than they might from the scientific community directly. May or may not understand the day-to-day challenges of agriculture. And then another thing that came out of this work is that people were emphasizing the need to meet in comfortable spaces. Some of the places where interviewees had their networks meet were coffee shops and breweries. It's also important in these networks to foster consistent and supportive relationships. So for the peer network organizer, that means reaching out to farmers to check in and coming without an agenda. So you're reaching out and you're being there to support farmers by celebrating their success and helping them work through challenges. And really developing that relationship when you're not trying to ask them to come to an event or ask them to do something for you to build that foundation of the relationship. When you're just getting started or when you're trying to expand the reach of your network, partnering with other organizations can help to lend credibility and access new audiences. It's also important to note that these relationships take time to build and can be especially difficult if you're new to the role. One of the interviewees that I talked with talked about how they're new to the role and they didn't get any kind of introduction or transition period when they started. And so there was kind of this confusion about the leadership that made it difficult to establish relationships with the farmer members when they got started. Some of the network organizers also implemented small or closed group meetings. This can be really effective because it makes it more comfortable for farmers to share sensitive information and form closer relationships with each other. This can lead to dense networks that can help alleviate peer pressure. As one of the interviewees said, the assembly has helped with that, namely peer pressure and bullying, because the farmers go and spend time with like-minded people in this space. They have even shared stories of their neighbor questioning had they lost their sanity. I definitely think it's helped in terms of supporting each other, maybe breaking down some of those barriers. It's also critical that farmers are leaders in the network. Every network should be seeking and noting farmer feedback in whatever form it comes. Oftentimes, it's difficult to get farmer feedback in the context of a formal survey, but that feedback might be shared verbally in a meeting in terms of like what topics farmers are interested in learning about or concerns they have with the network. So it's important to be aware of that and always trying to note that feedback comes. The next step after this is asking farmers to take leadership roles. In the context of this project, different interviewees implemented all of these different ideas in terms of asking farmers to be part of an advisory board, host a field day, share their story as a speaker, or join a small group. Ultimately, the goal is for these networks to be farmer-led and for the organizer to serve as a resource person. I think that this interviewee highlights that perspective really well when he says, I don't come in with an agenda. I literally tell every farmer, you're in the driver's seat, I'm riding shotguns. I'll help you with the direction, but you're still driving. And I think this second quote highlights what can happen when you put farmers in the driver's seat. This quote comes from one of the interviewees whose network is primarily run by farmers. And this is a motto that has been kind of developed by the farmers who lead the network. Here it says, no one is the smartest in the room and no one is smarter than the room. So this kind of collaborative and humble motto, I think, is something that can be developed when farmers are the leaders. One of the most interesting things to come out of this research was the idea of making bold asks. This is something that I didn't see really reflected a lot in the, but did come out in this study. And so bold asks means asking farmers to take on commitments or higher levels of engagement in the network in a way that maybe goes beyond what might normally feel comfortable if you just met somebody. And so in this project, that looks like people asking farmers to invite more people to join the network, participate in shared goal setting, be politically engaged, and be willing to disagree with each other because they're invested in each other's success. And the first quote I want to highlight here is that whoever has the challenge or the question hosts. Each meeting is designed to sort of tackle challenges while they're in real time. And I wanted to highlight this because, first of all, it takes vulnerability to host something on your own farm, to host other farmers, and to show them your operation. But it takes an even higher level of vulnerability to host farmers when the meeting is centered around some kind of challenge or struggle that you're having. But the interviewee here highlighted how powerful these meetings can be because they're directly solving a challenge that the farmer has, and they might be solving a challenge that a lot of other farmers in the network have as well. But that's why I highlighted this under bold asks, because it's bold to ask a farmer to take on that level of openness. And this next quote, I think, does a really good job of highlighting that kind of disposition. The interviewee said, they do a really good job of putting themselves out there and being vulnerable and owning themselves. They literally challenge each other as peers to bring a guest to the next meeting. In this interviewee talked about how powerful it was for your neighbor to tell you, bring a guest. And that can be really powerful when it's your farmer neighbor. Another core part of these networks is offering field days. This is very common, but it's worth highlighting because these field days help to spark curiosity. They help convince the see it to believe it crowd. As some of the interviewees talked about, it can inspire light bulb or aha moments that can lead to change. And it's also important to note that often the inspiration to change comes from field observations of problems. So here one of the interviewees said they're seeing issues with erosion or lack of fertility or poor soil structure, and they're saying, what are some steps that I can do to start to improve this? And is there an economic benefit to maybe changing some practices? So just as observations of problems can lead to a desire, observations of solutions can help give farmers the motivation to try that new thing. The network challenges highlighted by interviewees vary, but some of the more common ones I want to highlight here. One of the common challenges was conversation domination or overly technical presentations by speakers. And part of the challenges with this is that when presentations are overly technical or one person dominates the conversation, often then the network is not meeting the needs of all levels of experience in the network. It's common for these networks to have a variety of different levels of experience with conservation practices. And so it's important to meet those different needs and interests. And so here the quote is, there has to be moderation because they're so excited about what they're doing that they want to dominate the conversation. There was also a theme in leadership being stretched thin. Farmer leaders being involved in many organizations being kind of overcommitted, and then also organizers themselves being stretched thin. So one of the interviewees said, farmer leader burnout is so real. No one's taking shifts. One person takes the brunt of it and then the next person. It's like dominoes, and that's how you lose momentum. Also logistical challenges in terms of finding a good time and place to meet, and also resourcing the meetings. One of the interviewees spoke to that concern, saying, it's so hard to pay for food and venue and all that. If we're reaching out to landowners outside our county, which pot of money do we use to pay for donuts and coffee? Divergent themes that I encountered that also impact a farmer's ability to adopt conservation practices include renter dynamics, how farmers respond to financial stress, and the importance of economics and storytelling. These are three of the key activities for network building. These activities are commonly practiced by networks, but it's worth highlighting their important role. That includes farmers as decision makers, elevating farmer leadership, creating social spaces where farmers can interact with each other, and hosting field days where farmers can see these conservation practices in action. But to really supercharge a network, you need that relational foundation. And that starts with consistent and supportive relationship building, both between the network organizer and the farmers themselves. And that builds trust in the network that allows you to make bold asks of farmers in the network. Ask them to come into the network with greater levels of engagement, asking them to take leadership roles. That really creates a dense network that people are excited about. And so I'd like to thank all of my advisors for all the work that you put into coaching me and providing me feedback, helping me navigate the challenges of this project. Thanks to all the interviewees and my family and friends who have supported me. And now I'm ready to take any questions.
Grace, in your new job, are you going to be using any of your tips?
Oh, yes. This project was very helpful for the interviews, I would say, because I kind of found myself referring back to things that I had learned through this project a lot in how I would approach, interactions.
Is there anything that was surprising or that you didn't expect that came out of this?
Yeah, I would say something that I didn't highlight in this presentation as much was people talked about some of the unexpected benefits of conservation, like farming being fun rather than boring. And so that's something I didn't expect. as well as like fields just being like some people practice no-till and the benefit of like not being bumped around in your equipment as you go across your field. So those were some of the unexpected benefits that I was interested in. And then this theme of bold asks I thought was really intriguing to me and something that I didn't necessarily expect.
So related to the bold asks, I mean, one of the chronic problems that land grant institutions have been undergoing is this erosion of like cooperative extension over time. You know, it used to be a much more extensive network, you know, at every university that, you know, every county had an extension agent, and those were the people who were making the regular connections, going through and talking to farmers. When you know, of course, not one person can reconstruct that entire system, but like where would you see as being places that you could start like making inroads to really advocate for bringing back, if not that system, that's something that's equivalent to it? So you don't have all of this resting on the backs of a few volunteers who are just burning out because they're farming in addition to having to carry this load.
Yeah, I think it's really important to expand the leadership roster of people. As one of the interviewers talked about having a roster of farmer leaders. And so I think like programs that are centered around developing a leadership and how can we develop leadership that knows how to develop more leadership, I think would be really good, because I think part of the key of being a good leader is knowing how to develop new leaders as well, because you can't just have it all resting on yourself. And I think doing that would be really good, because as you've said, like right now, the responsibilities of these networks are falling on a very dedicated minority of people. Thank you for your question.
Great presentation. Did the interviewees talk about temporal aspects of networking activities change throughout the year, change over time, i.e. has there been an increase in networks?
An increase in networks over the past few years. But in terms of the annual schedule of these networks, it was common in some of these networks to only meet in the off season, and that seemed to be pretty effective for some networks. One of the common challenges was if you aren't taking in farmer feedback about when to meet, or if you're scheduling meetings more spontaneously, in one case due to a vocal minority perhaps who didn't want to like schedule things too far ahead of time, that seemed to result in lower engagement.
Curious if the organizer talked at all about gender and age dynamics within the groups, and whether those are something that they pay attention to.
Yeah, I would say that there wasn't as much discussion about the dynamics within the group, but I did have some discussions with some of the interviewees about their personal identity playing into how they interact with farmers. Like one of the interviewees, identified as like LGBTQ, and a woman, and so like that kind of played into like what they felt comfortable doing. Like this interviewee talked about how the previous person in her role, or their role, had like really encouraged them to like knock on people's doors and go to people's farms to reach out to them, and this interviewee just did not feel comfortable doing that. So that's something that kind of played in. And then I think another kind of interesting dynamic was the networks that were centered around like vegetable production. A lot of those farmers are maybe newer to farming or became farmers as adults. They didn't grow up on a farm. And so those networks actually seem to have a much easier time getting high levels of engagement because people seemed more eager to learn and get advice because they knew that they were coming from a background of like, I grew up doing this, I know what I'm doing.
Very interesting. Now we get to hear from one of our great partners, the Institute, to round out our annual webinar series. So I think it's a great way to end hearing new ideas coming from outside of this post network, but in a broader network.
Hello, I'm Caleb Langworthy. I'm agroforestry technical trainer. I'm just going to give you a brief update on the work that we are doing in the state of Minnesota. This is I grabbed some photos off of the Library of Congress of blueberry pickers in northern Minnesota and systems that have been stewarded by Indigenous folks, particularly Lakota and Ojibwe folks, for several millennia. Traditional agroforestry, Indigenous agroforestry practices include forest farming. They also include practices like maple syrup production and using cultural fire as a mechanism to maintain these systems. These are photos from our communications associate, Tyre Pear, who is a Turtle Mountain band of Ojibwe that is now living here in St. Paul. Some more recent examples of Indigenous agroforestry in the state include Red Lake Nation Foods. They've developed a whole line of products using jams, jellies, and syrups, featuring traditional fruit crops such as chokecherry, hazelnut, plum, to make these products, as well as maple syrup.
Caleb, what's the one on the right?
Those are ramps. Present day, what are we doing here in Minnesota? In Savanna, with Savanna Institute, there are 3 of us working in the state right now that are specifically focused in serving folks in the state. The first is my colleague Jen Rick. She joined the Minnesota team in January as an agroforestry advisor. Her role is working directly with institutions across the state. So we recognize that institutions like churches or schools, universities even, have larger, more complex decision-making structures, and often adoption of agroforestry practices on land that they steward can be more complex and take a longer time period. So she is, they are there to guide them through a longer, more involved decision-making process. Leah Snavely joined us last August. She came to us from the Yale School of Forestry, where she received her degree, master's degree in agroforestry. So we have a certified forester on our team as well. She is able to help us write forest management plans so that we can manipulate canopies in agroforestry practices like forest farming, as well as silvopasture by reduction, which is increasingly popular in the state. And then there is myself, Caleb Langworthy, and I am a technical trainer. My role is in collaboration with the Minnesota Natural Resources Conservation Service. I provide training to natural resource professionals across the state. So I support local NRCS field offices and SWCD districts in planning agroforestry practices that they encounter in their day-to-day work across the state of Minnesota. It's highly variable given Minnesota's land cover. So we are able to provide that assistance. We also provide a little bit of training in that role as well. Working directly with landowners, one of our very first clients in the state of Minnesota, Colin Cureton, invited us out to work with Kurt Kimber, who applied to our technical assistance program about 2 years ago. So there's a little photo of myself and Kurt and Amber Leach, who was with Forever Green at the time, as well as Liz Dawson from the local NRCS office. Working with Kurt, he came up with a hazelnut planting design that met Kurt's goals. And we worked with Lizzie to apply for funding through NRCS for those that install. Point this one out because the very close connection with Forever Green, and I believe was the first Go First farm to be fully planted. Part of my work as an agroforestry technical trainer, I work with the University of Minnesota Extension in part to provide trainings to these natural resource professionals. Gary Wyatt's been with the University of Minnesota Extension for a number of years and has been hosting agroforestry institutes for a number of years. I joined him on his very, maybe about 5 years ago, down in Laverne, Minnesota, and we were planning a fair bit of windbreaks. We moved that training around the state. So it's been in recent years in Laverne, up in Baxter, Minnesota, Wabasha, Minnesota, and this year it will be at the Sugar National Wildlife Refuge. It's a 2.5-day training that includes workshops and on-farm visits. We cover a whole host of agroforestry practices, as well as some facilitating practices like a forest stand improvement or brush management to facilitate the adoption of agroforestry practices. Some of the crops that we encounter from folks asking us at Savanna Institute, how do I plant these crops? What are the horticultural recommendations? What are plant spacings? Will this work on my site? Those are often questions that we get when we plan these designs with clients. A very new one is honeyberry that is going into the juice market, often for wine or jams or jellies. Chestnut is another one that has been spearheaded by Badgerset Farm down in southeast Minnesota over the last 30 years or so, and has spawned a whole crew of folks down in that area planting chestnut as a crop. Of course, there's elderberry that has grown with the Midwest Elderberry Cooperative, and hazelnut. And hazelnut has become one of the most asked about crops that we encounter by a factor of many. And it's because of the work that you all do here at the university and partners like Regenerative Agriculture Alliance that are using those plants in their design systems for their pastured chickens. We exist in an ecosystem of technical assistance. They're prior to SI providing direct landowner technical assistance in the state. The Sustainable Farming Association, along with Great River Greening and the Center for Integrated Natural Resources Management Extension, they hosted 2 rounds of an LCCMR grant focused on silvopasture adoption in the state of Minnesota and developed a lot of great resources and networks around silvopasture as a practice. On the right there is a picture of a program technician. Her name is Brianna Wagner. She and her colleague, Nathan Harder, work at the Cottonwood County SWCD. They are wonderful educators, designers of windbreak systems across Cottonwood County and their region. They are often the go-to experts to designing, installing these systems. If I end up with a windbreak question, I'll go straight to them. Some of our partnerships, I mentioned NRCS, who provides the funding to keep myself and my colleague Lena on providing technical assistance across the state. My colleague Jen was able to join us under a NICWIF, a National Fish and Wildlife Foundation grant. And then in partnership with SWCD districts across the state. 2 other important partnerships that we have include University of Minnesota Extension. I work very closely with Gary Wyatt on not only the Agroforestry Institute, but also trainings based on individual development plans that conservation agents fill out every year. So this year we will be doing a series of 4 windbreak trainings across the state of Minnesota to educate districts on how to better plan windbreaks. Of note, the Savanna Institute is also the Midwest lead on the Expanding Agroforestry project. That was formerly a Practice for Climate Smart Commodity grant that was terminated under the Trump administration and then reevaluated and was refunded as well under the Advancing Markets for Producers grant. The last thing I'll say is that the Savanna Institute can't do it alone. We choose to work with nonprofits and organizations across the country to build power to implementing agroforestry practices across this country. There's networks and working groups that focus on policy, demonstration farms, ecological services, as well as nursery stock and technical assistance and training.
What kind of chestnuts are being grown? Are these blight resistant ones or?
Yeah, well,
It's mainly Chinese chestnut and hybrid chestnut. We're less involved with trying to restore the American chestnut. We're more focused on the chestnuts that are grown for commercial production. Cool. Well, I'll go ahead and switch over a little bit to research now, and I suppose I'm introducing myself as well because I'm the new kid on the block here. So the research program at Savanna Institute has really kind of blown up in the last few years. Thanks to some funding that we got from the Grantham Foundation. And so for those of you who are maybe not as familiar with the structure, the research structure as it currently stands at Savanna Institute, we have got 12 people now who are in the research program. So Jose Franco is our director of research. Kevin Wolf's, of course, the guy who started it all, still part of the research program, although he is also heading Canopy Compass, our for-profit spinoff. And then largely speaking, we are two different major themes. I won't say we even break into two different groups because we interact with each other a lot, but there's the tree crop improvement program, where we have folks who are working on breeding 6 to 7, depending on whether you count Adam's pawpaw work as part of Savanna Institute. It's really his own private business. But we have a multitude of tree crops that we're actively working on breeding new varieties for. And then we have our agroecosystems group, which consists of Nate Lawrence, our ecosystem services scientist, Monica, our landscape ecologist, Zach, our image analyst, and myself. So I just started the position. A little bit about myself. There you go. I've been an agroecologist since 2012. I started in corn and soybean systems, and I've been working my way towards more perennial and fringe as I go. So more perennial, more diverse, and more emerging as we go. So I've done a lot of work with plant, soil, and insects interactions, looking at cover crops and their services that they provide, and monocultures and mixtures. For the past 7 years, I've been at the Land Institute, where I did a lot of work looking at different crop solutions for perennial grains. So now here I am in agroforestry, super excited to be working on it. And I would say, broadly speaking, my goals for the cropping system science program at SI is to continue or finish existing projects that already started. So even though I just got hired last year, the cropping systems scientist position has been like 5 years of the conception. So there actually are a number of agronomic projects that are already ongoing. And I have the luxury of jumping in and getting to analyze the data from those. I'm also going to be talking about or doing crop solutions experiments for specific TCIP species that we're breeding. I'll talk about one of those projects today. And more broadly speaking, I want to help to build a research network to implement cropping systems level studies across multiple sites. So super excited to be here and meet you guys. And, it's, as Kayla said, one organization cannot do it all. Certainly not one cropping system scientist can study 5 different agroforestry systems and 7 different breeding crops. So very eager to collaborate. So I thought I'd give a little sample of one study that's already been ongoing and some results we have from it, and then talk about a project that is upcoming and I'm excited about. This first project that I'm discussing has to do with alley cropping. So we work with a broad variety of agroforestry systems. And I would say, the most conventional system that we work with are more of these orchard type systems. As you know, trees are need babied. They're kind of wimps when you first put them in the ground, right? That's a very different system than if you're growing corn and soybeans. So people who are working in sort of the more traditional corn soybean settings, if you'd say trees, usually what they think of is something like this orchard on the left that is really high intensity, high management, requires irrigation. And they may be reluctant to sign up for that because, they just don't have the knowledge or the time or the money to be able to invest in that kind of work. On the flip side, so NRCS is more interested in if you're trying to set up plantings is something that's more conservation based. So maybe a little more like the prairie strips that they're implementing out in Iowa, for example. So we're interested in seeing, like, is it possible to set up an agroforestry, like mixed hardwood system, more like the prairie plantings? And if so, kind of how much can we get away with in order to get that established? How much can we minimize inputs to alley cropping agroforestry systems and still have good establishment? So to ask this question, we have help to answer this question, we have an alley cropping system that is set up in central Illinois, just outside of Champaign, at Allerton Park. I don't know, has anybody been there before? No. Beautiful location. I highly recommend it. There are actually really beautiful places in central Illinois, I swear. You just have to get off the interstate. See, they have trees in the distance. Yeah, no, it's a really beautiful site. And gorgeous farmland, of course. So this is a system that was traditionally just planted in corn and soybeans. Starting in 2020, Kevin Woltz and Katie Adams, who's our Demo Farms director, who's located down in Champaign, they planted this several 30-foot wide tree crop strips. So there's actually 3 rows of trees within that strip. And then in between those strips are 200 feet wide corn and soybean rotation. So it's still kept in conventional corn and soybean. And then you have these strips in the middle. Now this is, I would say the corn and kind of the spacing, of the alleys apart from each other is kind of something that we might envision as being a working system, working in like an Illinois landscape with the width of the tractors and everything that they have. Within the tree systems themselves, though, we went really complex, which makes my community ecology hard saying. So instead of just planting like one or a couple of different species of trees, we actually planted 9 different species of trees and shrubs into this system because we wanted to evaluate as many different species as possible under these management regimens. So there's a combination of, timber value trees such as black walnut, white oak. There's hickory. There's, more riparian buffer species like river birch. There's fruit-bearing plants like serviceberry and chokecherry. And then there's just kind of flat out conservation plants like eastern redbud. So a whole mix of different tree species. We also had a black locust study adjacent to it, but I'm not going to be showing those data today. If anybody has questions about that, I can explain a little bit more about that later. But then, in addition to those species that I just showed you, there's a full factorial study going on within each of these strips where individual strips, 3 of each, were either planted as a prairie mixture. I think the original NRCS mixture had like 42 species in it. I would say maybe a dozen of those actually established, pretty reliably. And then there's kind of a low-mow orchard mixture. So it's a couple of fescues and white clover, grows low to the ground, doesn't require as much mowing, sort of standard for orchard planting. And then that, in turn, was crossed with a weed management where either herbicide strips were applied just right around the trees in order to eliminate weeds on an annual basis. 3-foot weed mats were put in at the beginning of the experiment and kind of maintained for the first 5 years. They're starting to break down, but most of them are still there. So they've lasted a pretty long time. And then there was a mowing only treatment where just mowed the grass and saw how they did. I'll also add that there was no irrigation and there was no fertilization of trees. So we did go in and replace trees after the first year that had died, but otherwise, again, wanted to keep this as minimal as possible, to see how well would they do. This is what the field looks like, and here's where those strips are located. So lighter colors are sort of lighter treatment, low mow, all the way up to the darker colors, which is the herbicide, more intensive treatments. And I like to see that in the satellite, you can actually kind of see the color differences in both the, intercrop that was planted and also the different treatments that are being applied. So that's pretty cool. The whole site is about 35 acres. And then the data that we collected were looking at Proportion survival and relative growth, because we're limited for time today, I'm just going to show you the proportion survival, but we do have also the relative growth performance for each species by weed treatment, by intercrop interaction. So what did we find? Well, here's a whole bunch of bars on a graph. We've got all the species laid out across the bottom. Proportion survival is on the left-hand side, and then the colors represent the different intercrops and treatments. I'll walk you through this graph because there's a lot to see here. First off, I'm going to draw a line across that graph that's at 85% because that's sort of the cutoff for NRCS for like successful establishment of trees. And how many species actually made that bar? Well, I would say that 4 of those species reliably made that bar, across at least half of the weed and intercrop treatments that we applied to them. So river birch, chokecherry, oak, and serviceberry all did pretty well, or quite well, I would say. The ones who really stunk were alder and hickory. They did not like these conditions. They were not happy with them overall and never met that cutoff. So then, that leaves 3 species that under certain circumstances were able to meet that 85%, at least statistically. So honestly, I'm pretty impressed that many species we were able to get at least one combination of weed management and intercrop that allowed for that establishment without fertilizer or irrigation. Another thing that was really interesting is that in a couple of cases, the herbicide treatment actually made the plants do worse. And those cases were alder, redbud, and we also saw this data in our black locust too. So alder is a nitrogen fixer. Both redbud and locust are legumes. And one of the herbicides that was used was an herbicide called oust, which as it turns out is really bad for legumes. So lesson learned, don't use that herbicide. But it does go to show that general thinking is that if you apply herbicides and relieve weed pressure, it's going to make the tree do better. And what we're able to show here is that's not necessarily the case. You got to be careful about what kind of herbicide you use. The ones that really seemed to benefit the most from herbicide were the chokecherry and the walnut treatments, particularly in those prairie systems. So if you wanted to plant like an NRCS kind of prairie mixture, ironically, maybe also using herbicides in that prairie mixture. So I suppose you can balance out whether you think that's a system that's providing the best ecosystem services or not. Fun debate. So these data, currently writing it up for agroforestry systems, but also what I hope to do is develop a tool, to give growers recommendations as to what kinds of combinations seem to work pretty well, if they want to plant certain species. And then in future years, we're going to start collecting the corn and soybean data too, to start seeing, now that these trees are established, we can start seeing not only how did the trees do, but how are the trees affecting the corn and soybean crop, and looking at a more systems approach. So how are we doing for time?
Good. We have one thing, so.
Okay, well, I don't know what time it is.
Oh, I'm sorry, it's
It's 5 after 9.
it's almost one.
Okay, cool, thank you. So that is a project that we've already had underway and have some data on. This is a project that I'm pretty excited about. I hear y'all like hazelnuts, so I thought I'd talk about hazelnuts today. It seems to be a thing. And I've jokingly called this hot and cold. I don't know if anybody here is a Katy Perry fan or not, but the key collaborators in this are going to be Adam D'Angelo and Scott, of course, at least for this initial stage of the experiment. And then external is going to be David Flubik at Rutgers, whose work I'll be talking about in a minute. So kind of the big picture reasoning, behind a lot of these emerging crops is that you often don't know how to manage it because it's a new crop. So the logical thing to do is to start with what is it related to that's already a crop and work backwards from there. So in the case of silphium at the Land Institute, it's often like, okay, well, what's sunflower doing? Because that's in the same family, and then you try to infer from there. That works to some extent sometimes. It does seem to be increasingly, that there do seem to be instances in the case of American hazelnut that it's not turning out to be European hazelnut. So that's not an approach that always works. American hazelnut tends to be this shrub that we're growing on the landscape, and the nutrient requirements seem to be somewhat different. The growth pattern is different. So that working backwards method is only has limited use. We need to start developing, things that are, growing tactics that are specific to the American and the hybrid hazelnut. Some of the questions that I've heard a lot about listening in on the group discussions are about pruning and fertilizing. So when do you prune the shrub? When do you fertilize it? How do you prune it? How much do you cut back in order for it to, put more into nut production and less into vegetative production? Well, in order to do those things, you have to know, when is it developing its buds? When are those buds differentiating into, vegetative buds versus flowering buds? When does bud break occur? What's the seasonal growth patterns? So this is like basic phenological data that need to be measured. What influences that to a great degree is temperature. So in the case of hazelnuts, you need growing degree days, which you need for virtually any plant species that you're talking about. But chill portions or chilling hours are also super important, because if these hazelnuts aren't getting enough cold period in winter, then their buds won't bloom properly. So chill portions isn't exactly the same as chill hours. It takes into account the number of hours that the temperature is below a certain threshold, but then it also accounts for hot days in the summer where the temperature is higher than expected that might offset those chill hours. So that's what chill portions means. This is something that I've had to learn as I've gone. But that's kind of a quick and dirty explanation of it. Why do we need to know chill hours and growing degree hours? Well, I don't know if you noticed, but Minnesota is a really long state. It's a really long state. Caleb has driven, a third of it this morning? Yeah. And it took 4 hours, right? Minnesota is in the top 10 for longest states, north to south in the country. I looked it up. And, and it's right next to lakes and rivers and, things that cause massive differences in the number of growing degree days. So this is just an example of growing degree days, that I took from Luke Haggerty here at UMN. In discussion of grape development, but that gives you a picture of what the enormous variability is. If you combine that with Monica's maps from our organization that she made up to look at suitability for where hazelnuts can be grown, again, you're talking about regions that are highly suitable being extremely different, almost 1,000 growing degree days different just in the course of 1 month. For one crop. It's, to say, I really think that we need a good growing degree hour and chilling portion model for hazelnut in order to give good recommendations, because to tell a farmer, oh, you should prune in July when the differences are this huge, it's just not going to work. I think it would be really better to have a model that helps to dial that in. So, fortunately, David has made the first strides in doing this. This is his dissertation that I'm pulling from. So I don't think it's peer-reviewed published yet, but his dissertation is available online through Rutgers if you want to download it and read it. Where he actually went through and calculated the chilling portions of growing degree hours for both American hazelnut, European hazelnut, and several hybrids. And found, as you can see, an enormous variation. So the chilling portion for catkins range between 9.3 to 30.7. So the species are vastly different. The hybrids, of course, are going to be all across the board because they're hybrids. So I think in order to do this for commercial production, we're going to need to dial it into a few of the varieties that are looking most promising for this region. So that is what I'm proposing to do next and David is helping us with this. So The objectives will be to determine chill hour requirements or chilling portion requirements for the Beast, which is a hybrid that came out of Rutgers, and it is one that we have growing at Savanna Institute already, as well as maybe about 4 of the most agronomically promising Wisconsin and Minnesota cultivars. This will be a combination of field and lab experiment. We're already collecting intensive phenological data on populations in the field. The lab portion is going to be going out, cutting stems off of these in the fall, bringing them in, putting them in warm conditions, and literally seeing whether they go through bud break or not. So it's going to be a really intensive experiment, time-intensive experiment that's going to take a lot of plants, and I think we're set up to do that at Savanna Institute because we have those large plantings of hazelnuts at our North Farm, our organic farm. Then we can start actually linking that field phenology data from those cultivars and the lab data that we collected to the temperature station data that we have on the Valley Farm. That's what PF stands for. From there, establishing the baseline temperature is a little trickier, but it can be done through bottle testing. So this is something that I've actually done with Silpium and Tegrifolium because we need to develop a growing degree hour model for that. And Kevin's sitting in the back there. One of his folks, Sydney, actually, she had a data set where it was much more intensive data that was collected at one site. Here in Minnesota, there are a couple of sites that she was able to do this model on. And then I did the same analysis, but on data that was collected by citizen scientists across like the entire US. And we actually were able to converge on the same baseline temperature. So it does seem to be a model that works, and I think this could work here too. Yeah, so I'm hoping within 3 to 5 years we can have some chilling portion and growing degree hour models for American hazelnut varieties, and this will improve our ability to time fertilization, pruning, and other experimental manipulations, with on-site annual temperatures. Long term, I would like to do something like a citizen science program, and again, be super interested in collaborating on this, where if you have growers who are growing these already, or even people who have a few varieties in their backyard, like we were able to do this with Silpium with not very many plants, and all they have to do is go out and take pictures and send them to you, and then you can have one person scoring the pictures and looking at the growth stage of those plants, matching it up with if there is weather station available at the site, you can use that. But actually, NOAA climate data online works pretty well too, especially if you're looking at a much larger regional scale. And you can help really build out these models to cover a wider geographic range. This is something that is kind of my passion project, and I hope to implement over a longer term in regards to intercropping plants together. So one of the major challenges with perennial systems is you cannot rely on crop rotation anymore for your diversity. I love cover crops. I love working with cover crops and adding that diversity into annual rotations. But when you have something that lives 20 years, that rotation goes out the window. You have to take that diversity in time and put it into diversity in space. And that is not easily done. And honestly speaking, the method we still do most intercropping studies is trial and error. Take 2 plants that seem promising, put them together. Does it work? Does it not work? I feel pretty strongly with these perennial systems and with impending climate change, we don't have time for that approach. That we need to find ways to at least narrow down the enormous pool of options that are out there in order to make it more effective. In order to select a subset of intercrops that you can then test through trial and error. This is a project that I started at the Land Institute and would be, very interested in building out and continuing. And that's the idea of better living through phytochemistry. So normally when we, I wouldn't say normally, there are certain points where we think about phylogeny in terms of when to plant things together. So grasses and legumes are a winning combination. We know that already, right? And it's often thought or maybe assumed that if 2 things are more phylogenetically distant from each other, then they're more likely to grow together than if they were closely related. We decided to take a different approach and actually look at phytochemistry of the plants. And by phytochemistry, I mean like measuring the volatile organic compounds that are coming out of plants, because it's a nice non-destructive system that you can use in order to assess like what chemicals are plants producing in different situations or by different species. We actually did an experiment where we took 3 different perennial grain species, Silflower, Kernza, and Alfalfa, and we grew them with 9 other different species in every pairwise combination imaginable that were either more or less chemically distant or more or less phylogenetically distant from that plant. And it turns out that like phylogeny didn't matter at all within these systems, but phytochemistry did. And it also depended on what your focal species was. So in the case of Silphium, what we found is that it actually grew a little bit better with plants that were more phytochemically similar to it. Whereas if the plants were less chemically similar, they did a little bit worse. Kernza there didn't seem to be a clear pattern. Alfalfa was the other way around. So as alfalfa actually does better when it grows with things that are more dissimilar to it. So I think this could be potentially a really interesting way or a cool way of determining how plants grow together. And can you just measure the chemical signature of a plant and use that in order to predict whether it might be a good intercrop or not, at least as a starting point. Wanted to point out kind of the limitations of doing this way is if we look at plant chloroplast genomes, there are about 7,000 species that have published chloroplast genomes, but we only have phytochemical profiles for about 300 species. So there's a real deficit in having the phytochemical data available in order to be able to do this. And that's where I think some long-term work comes in, which is how do we collect these phytochemical profiles? So we've worked with kids. This is work that I've developed with Chase Stratton, who was my postdoc and is now a professor at Delaware State University, where we've got these little kits designed that you can take out in the field and run off a little car battery that can collect volatiles off of plants. And then you can bring that back in and develop a chemical profile. One of the challenges to developing a chemical profile is once you run it through a GCMS, you get a whole bunch of peaks. And in the past, what you had to do to identify those peaks is you had to go through and click on every single peak and then match it to a database to figure out what that chemical is. So Chase and our research group actually developed an R package that automates that process. So now it used to take weeks or months to be able to do multiple data sets like this. Now it takes hours, and it is as accurate as the manual process. So I think this is a way that we can start building this phytochemical database to look at intercropping and do it by involving education. So here we're looking at the kind of the time that it takes to do all this. So 2.5 hours to do this. Once you run the GCMS, takes about 2 hours, and then about 3 to 4 hours, say, to run, your R package in order to get that. So this has now been condensed into a time frame that you can start making it a learning module in classes. And this is a project that I'm going to spin, or I'm developing right now with Madison Area Technical College, where because they have a botany class and it has a lab course. So, okay, let's make it a lab course where everybody goes out with a kit, pick a plant, whatever plant you want, put a bag on it, measure the volatiles for 2 hours. We can bring those samples in. They have a GCMS there. We can run the samples on the GCMS. We run those, collected samples through the R package, and boom, they have a set of chemicals that they can then do an in-lab learning experience, but learning about what are the classes of chemicals that they're finding? What are the implications of those? So it's this nice self-contained module. And as they do that year after year after year, they're building the database. So I'd be really, I want to try this with MATC first, but ultimately I'd like to expand this out to have a network across multiple universities where we're building this database so we can start using it in order to figure out how to grow things together. So, that's all I've got right now. Happy to talk with folks more afterwards, but I just wanted to take a moment to thank all of the people, the different funding sources that we've had, and the wonderful group at Savanna Institute. It's been a joy working here. And if you want to learn more about us, then there's a QR code and website.
Pete LaFontaine asked this, but he left some an email in your response.
Okay.
You were going through all those different trees up there.
Yeah.
And he said, I would have thought black walnut was a no-go in production systems. Be low happy.
Well, we haven't seen that so far. We did do one row of, when I showed that we had 3 rows across, only the center row of trees actually had the black walnut and hickory, and then they were framed on either side by the redbud, choke cherry, service berry, kind of the smaller, more ecologically friendly and crop friendly trees. So there may be an effect eventually. The only effects I see so far seem to be mainly just shade, from the black locust. So the black locust trees are way taller than everything else, and you're starting to see a bit of a shade effect, on the corn and soybeans. But yeah, that's something that we could measure going forward.
It's something that we've seen be successful in silvopasture vegetation systems because of the leaf structure. It allows more light to get to the herbaceous layer in those systems, allowing for more forage growth as well.
Okay. Yeah, good point.
Thank you both. This is really interesting stuff today. I had a question about the phytochemistry.
Yes.
And for some of those crops that you're finding that they really like the similar or the dissimilar, like the sunflower or the alfalfa, I'm wondering if that's something that would be like consistent for that crop across different like environmental contexts, like
No idea.
previous soil or anything like that. I was curious if you think that would be consistent for that species or if that might vary depending on other environmental factors.
That would be an excellent question. Somebody should do that experiment. Haven't done it yet. Yeah.
Instead of just the leaves, exudates.
Looking at the root exudates. Yeah, that could definitely be done too, like sticking a VOC collector down into the soil to collect root volatiles.
How were those grown? Were they in pots and?
They were
storage
in
and-
pots. They were in wide pots that were one plant on either side, and then we also compared it to a standard where it was 2 plants of the same species planted together, so standardized. Yeah, so it's definitely early days, for that kind of experiment. It's a proof of concept.
Great way to engage undergrads though.
Yeah, I'm actually really excited about it.
Caleb, I had a question about your partnership with NRCS. Yeah. Could you just say more about how that came about and, what brings them to the table of wanting you all to be playing these roles and.
Sure.
Yeah.
NRCS, up until the last couple of years, has annually put out something called a notice of funding opportunity for something like called a cooperative agreement. So NRCS knows that they don't have expertise in all of the fields. I think a common example is that they get assistance with is in developing wildlife habitat. So they partner a lot with Pheasants Forever or Ducks Unlimited. Audubon has a conservation grant with NRCS. One of the things that they identified 2 years ago was the need for agroforestry technical assistance in the state. They were hearing from a lot of field offices that their planners were having trouble planning agroforestry practices that were successful long term. And so I, as a habit, show up to something called their state technical advisory committee. And they were asking for some agroforestry technical assistance in their next round of cooperative agreements. And so we raised our hand and said, yeah, let's work with NRCS on this. And we wrote the position that I'm in as a technical trainer and another position as a technical assistance provider working directly with clients under that agreement. There's a few other things that we're allowed to do under there, create some materials, and then provide some input onto their practice standards to improve it and make it more accessible for the field office. So one of the things that we're working on with our forester right now is appropriate sites for silvopasture subtraction, developing field guidance for staff to bring out to the field and do a checklist. Yes, no, this site is suitable, or not for this practice. So those are some of the things that we do.
For your establishment test, did you have to deal with like deer?
Oh, yes.
It's like I have a service barrier trying to establish that yard.
Yeah.
They love it.
They do. Well, we dealt with the deer. It had mixed results for serviceberry. I'll say that. So what Kevin did was he put 6-foot plastic tubes on everything. So the serviceberry definitely established. Unfortunately, it was kind of like the serviceberry equivalent of foot binding, though, because in a 6-foot tube, because like the branches just like it was still a shrub, so the branches kind of got all gnarled together, and then it got top heavy and started breaking off the top. So it's live, it's producing berries, but it's not the happiest configuration for serviceberry. So we're starting to do work at the demo farm, and we're starting with different species, black locust, but we're interested in doing different tubing experiments with like 6-foot tubes, 2-foot tubes, like shorter tubes to see like how tall of a tube do you need in order to get the plant to the point where you don't have it destroyed by buck rub, or by browsing. But also don't get that weird situation that we got with our service berries.
For that system, what do you imagine is the pitch to the farmer? I mean, there's a conservation pitch, the benefits of a windbreak, but and I've read about in the field benefits of having some shade, of having moderated climate from those kind of plantings. So maybe that is boosting their corn and soy yield enough to offset some. I guess so it's all those reasons, but how important do you think the eventual harvest is? Because,
Of the forest or
the eventual harvest of the agroforestry, because not that many people are going to go out and hand harvest service berries and valorize those, right? So but someday they might cut down walnut trees and make a lot of money. So
exactly.
But
that's a really good point, and I don't think that everything that we planted in there is necessarily will necessarily be able to get like good commercial, value data off of. So some of those trees are more likely to just be planted as part of like windbreaks or conservation, right? Other trees might have additional values, such as the walnut. I wouldn't see the serviceberry in this kind of situation being like part of a commercially viable system. So I would say in this system, we're also measuring the changes in soil, looking at the hydrology as well. So we're checking erosion, we're checking building of organic matter. Those are some of the services that I think that are more likely to be of benefit to whoever's growing that corn and soy crop. So Nate has those data. I couldn't tell you at this point what they look like, but that's the longer term. Yeah, I'm happy to field ideas for things to collect. Like the system's been there for 5 years and kind of getting established, and now that we have these survival data, it's kind of like, okay, now what? So very open to ideas that we could collect.
I guess I'll say that timber tends to be the one that is viable for most folks. When I see this out in the field, usually it's in smaller or niche production systems. So I'm thinking of systems that include, like, usually it's a shrub layer. Park shepherd is pretty common of doing alley cropping with hazelnuts and then cropping like a vegetable in between. Other farms that I've seen it on, it's been rows of blueberries or some other sort of shrub and then cropping annual vegetables in between. And that's something that we do on our north farm as well.
The whole alley cropping, like, my goodness, that one term is so vastly different, like it can be anything, intercropped with anything, basically. Like it could be vegetables, it could be forage, it could be grain. I guess we're kind of going at the most Illinois system we could think of, which is corn and soybeans on flat land. But yeah, you're right, Caleb. That's not necessarily how most people do it.